The morning fog hung low over Chicago's skyline as Peter Matthews stood at his apartment window for the last time. 28 years old, with dark hair that caught the light just right and eyes that held secrets he wasn't ready to share, Peter had made a decision that would change everything. The suitcase by his feet contained his entire life, or at least, the life he was willing to take with him. His fingers traced the edge of his passport, worn from previous travels that no one in Chicago knew about. The official stamp pages told stories of business trips that weren't quite what they seemed. Peter's profession remained a mystery even to his closest friends, hidden behind vague explanations of consulting work and international projects. But today, he was leaving that shadowy world behind, or so he told himself. The Uber notification chimed on his phone. Time to go. As the car pulled away from the familiar streets of Lincoln Park, Peter watched his old life disappear in the rearview mirror. The driver, a chatty man named Jose, tried to make conversation about his destination. Madrid? Huh? Beautiful city. You visiting family? Peter's jaw tightened slightly. Family. That was complicated. His parents had stopped asking questions about his work years ago, accepting the mysterious nature of his frequent absences with resigned disappointment. His sister Emily knew something was different about her brother, but she'd learned not to pry. The goodbye dinner 3 nights ago had been awkward, filled with unspoken concerns and careful words. Starting fresh, Peter replied simply, his Chicago accent still thick despite years of international travel. The memories of his childhood home on the north side flooded back as they passed familiar landmarks. Wrigley Field, where his father had taken him to countless Cubs games. The lakefront where he'd had his first kiss at 16. The coffee shop on Clark Street where he'd spent hours studying business at DePaul University, never imagining his life would take such an unexpected turn. But Chicago held more than just nostalgic memories. It held the weight of decisions he'd rather forget, contracts he wished he'd never signed, and people who still thought they owned pieces of his soul. The consulting firm where he'd supposedly worked for the past 5 years knew better than to ask too many questions about his real activities. The less they knew about Peter's actual clients, the better for everyone involved. At O'Hare International Airport, Peter moved through security with practiced ease. His carry-on contained the essentials: high-end laptop, encrypted hard drives, and documents that would raise eyebrows if anyone knew how to read them properly. But to casual observers, he looked like any other young professional heading overseas for business. The departure gate buzzed with typical airport energy. Families sang tearful goodbyes, business travelers typing frantically on laptops, and the occasional adventurer heading off to unknown destinations. Peter found himself in the latter category, though his adventure was more escape than exploration. As boarding began for Iberia Flight 6275 to Madrid, Peter caught sight of his reflection in the terminal window. The man staring back looked confident, even charming, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. The burner phone in his pocket had been buzzing all morning with messages he had no intention of answering. His old life was calling, but Peter Matthews was officially unavailable. Peter settled into his business class seat, a luxury he could afford thanks to his mysterious profession. The flight attendant, a young Spanish woman named Carmen, offered him champagne with a smile that lingered just a moment longer than professional courtesy required. Even in his conflicted state, Peter's natural magnetism was evident. "First time to Madrid?" Carmen asked in accented English, clearly drawn to the handsome American with the intense gaze. "Yes, but hopefully not the last," Peter replied, his charm automatic despite his inner turmoil. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Peter's mind drifted back to the events that had led to this moment. 3 months ago, everything had changed. A job in Prague that went sideways. Questions from people he'd trusted. The realization that his carefully constructed double life was beginning to crumble. The consulting firm had been the perfect cover. Matthews and Associates specialized in international risk assessment, which could mean anything and nothing. His official clients were multinational corporations seeking market analysis in emerging economies. His unofficial clients operated in much grayer areas of international commerce. Peter had justified it for years. The information he gathered and sold wasn't technically illegal, just highly sensitive. Corporate espionage lived in a moral gray zone that he'd learned to navigate with practiced ease. He told himself he was just a very well-paid researcher, connecting dots that others couldn't or wouldn't connect. But Prague had shown him the real consequences of his work. Seeing the faces of people whose lives had been disrupted by information he'd provided had shattered his carefully maintained emotional distance. The family-owned factory that had been forced to close. The small investors who'd lost everything when their company's secrets were exposed to competitors. Peter realized he'd become something he never intended to be. The plane lifted off from Chicago, and Peter watched his city shrink below him. Lake Michigan stretched endlessly to the east, and for a moment, he felt like he was leaving everything that defined him behind. Which, he supposed, was exactly the point. His phone buzzed one last time before airplane mode. A text from an unknown number. "Running won't solve anything, Matthews. We know where you're going." Peter deleted the message and powered down his phone. Whatever games his former associates wanted to play, they'd have to play them without him. The flight to Madrid would take 8 hours. 8 hours to transform from Peter the information broker to Peter the digital nomad. He'd been preparing for this transition for months, setting up legitimate freelance clients, building a portfolio of actual consulting work that had nothing to do with corporate secrets or gray market intelligence. Sitting beside him was Eduardo Ramirez, a Madrid-based wine importer who struck up a conversation during the meal service. Eduardo was returning from a business trip to Chicago, and his enthusiasm for his home city was infectious. "Madrid is not like Barcelona," Eduardo explained, gesturing with his wine glass. "Barcelona is beautiful, but it shows off. Madrid keeps its secrets hidden until you earn them. The Real Madrid is in the small bars in Malesana, in the late-night conversations in Retiro Park, in the way the city comes alive after midnight." Peter found himself genuinely interested. His previous travels had always been focused on work, on targets and objectives. The idea of discovering a city for pure enjoyment felt foreign but appealing. "And the women," Eduardo continued with a conspiratorial smile. "Spanish women are not impressed by money or fancy cars. They want to know your soul. They want passion, authenticity. You cannot fake your way into a Spanish woman's heart." The comment hit Peter unexpectedly. When was the last time anyone had seen his authentic self? Years of constructing personas and playing roles had left him unsure of who he really was underneath it all. Eduardo pulled out his phone and showed Peter photos of Madrid's neighborhoods. "Where will you stay?" "Malesana," Peter replied, remembering his Airbnb booking. "Near the Plaza del Dos de Mayo." Eduardo's eyes lit up. "Ah, perfect choice. The heart of old Madrid. But be careful, that neighborhood has a way of capturing souls. Many people go there for a few weeks and never leave." As the conversation continued, Peter found himself sharing more than he intended. Not the dangerous truths about his past, but genuine thoughts about wanting to change his life, about feeling disconnected from himself, about the desire to discover who he could be without the weight of his mistakes. "You sound like a man running from something," Eduardo observed perceptively. Peter's smile faltered slightly. "Maybe running toward something instead." "In my experience," Eduardo said, raising his glass in a small toast, "the best journeys involve a little of both." The rest of the flight passed with Peter alternating between sleep and anxious anticipation. His dreams were filled with fragments of his Chicago life, late nights in anonymous office buildings, encrypted communications, the faces of people whose trust he'd betrayed. But they were also filled with images of Madrid streets he'd never seen, of possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. What do you think about Peter's journey so far? Are you curious about what secrets he's hiding and what awaits him in Madrid? Let us know in the comments what you think Peter's real profession might be. The plane began its descent toward Madrid-Barajas Airport as the Spanish countryside spread out below them. Rolling hills dotted with olive groves gave way to the sprawling urban landscape of one of Europe's great capital cities. Peter's heart rate increased as reality set in. He was actually doing this. Eduardo helped him with recommendations for his first days in the city. "Start with the basics," he advised. "Walk through El Retiro Park at sunset. Try Jamón Ibérico at Mercado de San Miguel. And whatever you do, don't eat dinner before 10 o'clock. The locals will think you're a tourist. As they prepared for landing, Eduardo handed Peter his business card. If you need anything, or if Madrid begins to overwhelm you, call me. The city can be intense for newcomers. Peter pocketed the card gratefully. It had been years since someone had offered him help without expecting something in return. Madrid-Barajas Airport buzzed with typical international airport energy. But Peter felt every sensation with heightened awareness. The sound of rapid Spanish conversations, the smell of strong coffee, the organized chaos of arrival procedures. It all felt like stepping into a new world. Immigration was routine, though Peter noticed the officer studying his passport with professional interest. His travel history raised questions he hoped wouldn't be asked. Fortunately, American business travelers were common enough not to warrant additional scrutiny. Collecting his luggage from baggage claim, Peter's mind was focused on the logistics of his new life. Taxi to the apartment, get settled, find a local phone plan, locate the nearest grocery store. Simple tasks that felt momentous given their context. That's when he saw her. She was standing near the international arrivals exit, not waiting for anyone specific but scanning the crowd with purpose. Latina features, long dark hair, wearing a simple black dress that somehow made her stand out from everyone around her. But it wasn't her beauty that caught Peter's attention. It was the way she looked directly at him. Their eyes met across the crowded terminal, and Peter felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine surprise. Her gaze wasn't casual or coincidental. She was looking for him specifically, though he was certain they'd never met. The woman's expression shifted slightly when she confirmed his identity. Not shock, but satisfaction, as if a puzzle piece had fallen into place. She didn't approach him, didn't wave or gesture. She simply watched him with dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Peter found himself frozen, luggage cart forgotten, trying to process this unexpected development. Was she connected to his past? Someone sent by his former associates to track his movements? Or was this something else entirely? But before he could decide how to react, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd with practiced ease. Peter tried to follow, abandoning his luggage cart and pushing through the mass of travelers. But she was gone as if she'd never been there at all. Standing alone in the middle of the terminal, Peter questioned whether he'd imagined the entire encounter. The stress of leaving Chicago, the anxiety about starting over, the guilt about his past, maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew what he'd seen. Someone had been waiting for him in Madrid. Someone who knew he was coming. The question was whether she represented his past catching up with him or his future calling him forward. The taxi ride from the airport into central Madrid gave Peter his first real taste of his new city. The driver, Miguel, was a weathered man in his 50s who spoke broken English mixed with rapid Spanish, most of which Peter couldn't follow despite his college language courses. "Primera vez en Madrid?" Miguel asked, catching Peter's eye in the rearview mirror. "Sí, primera vez," Peter replied, exhausting most of his Spanish vocabulary in 3 words. Miguel laughed and launched into what Peter assumed was a tourist's guide to the city, pointing out landmarks and explaining their significance in passionate Spanish. Though he understood perhaps every 10th word, Peter found Miguel's enthusiasm infectious. This felt different from the anonymous business trips of his past, more personal, more real. The architecture amazed him as they drove through different neighborhoods. Unlike Chicago's grid system and towering skyscrapers, Madrid felt organic, grown rather than planned. Buildings from different centuries stood side by side, creating a visual history lesson. The afternoon light cast everything in warm golden tones that made even mundane street scenes look like paintings. "Malasana," Miguel announced as they entered Peter's new neighborhood. "Muy bohemio, muy artistico." The streets were narrow compared to Chicago's broad avenues, lined with small bars, vintage shops, and apartment buildings with wrought iron balconies. Young people sat on stoops and gathered in small plazas, speaking in animated Spanish that sounded like music to Peter's ears. The contrast with his sterile Chicago apartment was striking. There, everything had been chosen for function and anonymity. Expensive furniture that looked like a hotel, art selected by a decorator, a space that revealed nothing about its occupant's personality. Here, even from the taxi window, he could see life bursting from every balcony garden, every hand-painted sign, every group of friends sharing drinks on the sidewalk. Miguel pulled up to a narrow building on a side street off Plaza del Dos de Mayo. "A key," he announced, turning to help with Peter's luggage. The building was old but well-maintained, with a heavy wooden door and a small brass nameplate that read Edificio San Andres, Peter's temporary home for the next month, according to his Airbnb reservation. As Miguel drove away with a cheerful "Bienvenido a Madrid," Peter stood alone on the narrow sidewalk, surrounded by the sounds of a neighborhood coming alive for the evening. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing guitar. The smell of garlic and olive oil drifted from open windows. Children's laughter echoed from the small plaza around the corner. For the first time in months, Peter smiled without forcing it. The apartment building's entrance was typically European, a small foyer with mailboxes and a narrow staircase leading to the upper floors. Peter's temporary home was on the third floor, apartment 3B, according to the key instructions his Airbnb host had sent. The stairs creaked with age but felt solid beneath his feet. Each landing had a small window that looked out onto an interior courtyard where laundry hung from lines and potted plants created a small urban jungle. The building felt lived in, full of history and stories, so different from the sterile efficiency of his Chicago high-rise. Apartment 3B was small but perfectly appointed. High ceilings with exposed wooden beams, tile floors worn smooth by decades of use, and tall windows that opened onto a narrow balcony overlooking the street below. The furniture was eclectic, a mix of antique pieces and modern necessities that somehow worked together perfectly. Peter set down his luggage and walked to the balcony, pushing open the tall windows. The evening air was warm and carried the sounds of Madrid settling into night. Below, the narrow street buzzed with activity as locals emerged for their evening routines. He could see into the small bars and restaurants, watching people gather around tiny tables, gesturing expressively as they talked. This was exactly what he'd hoped for: authentic immersion in local life, rather than the isolated hotel rooms of his business travels. Here, he could disappear into the rhythm of a real neighborhood, become just another face in the crowd rather than a target to be tracked. But as he unpacked his belongings, Peter discovered something that made his blood run cold. Inside the antique wardrobe, hanging behind several old winter coats, was a manila envelope with his name written on it in neat handwriting. "Peter Matthews, welcome to Madrid." His hands shook slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single photograph, the woman from the airport, sitting at a cafe table with the Madrid skyline visible in the background. On the back, someone had written, "Cafe Central, Thursday, 8 p.m. Come alone." Thursday was tomorrow. Peter sat heavily on the bed, his mind racing. Either this was an elaborate coincidence, or his attempt to disappear had failed before it even began. The envelope looked old, as if it had been waiting for him for weeks or months. But that was impossible. He'd only booked this apartment 2 weeks ago, using a credit card under his legal name. Unless someone had been tracking his movements longer than he'd realized. The mysterious woman's face haunted him. She'd been beautiful, yes, but there was something else in her expression. Not malice, but knowledge. She knew things about him that he wasn't sure he knew about himself. Peter walked back to the balcony, looking down at the street with new awareness. Was someone watching him now? Were his former associates already closing in? Or was this something else entirely? As if summoned by his paranoid thoughts, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown Spanish number. "Madrid suits you better than Chicago ever did. Sweet dreams, Peter." He powered off his phone immediately, but the damage was done. Whatever game was being played, he was already several moves behind. Outside his window, Madrid continued its ancient rhythm, unaware that a young American's carefully planned escape had just become something much more complicated. The guitar music continued from a nearby balcony, mixing with laughter and conversation to create the soundtrack of his new life. A life that was already proving to be far more mysterious than he'd bargained for. As Peter tried to process this unexpected development, one thing became clear. Leaving Chicago hadn't freed him from his past. If anything, It had led him directly into a future that promised to be just as complicated, just as dangerous, and infinitely more intriguing than anything he'd left behind. The woman from the airport held the key to understanding what was happening to him. Tomorrow evening at Café Central, he would begin to learn whether she represented salvation or destruction. But tonight, in his small apartment overlooking the narrow streets of Malesana, Peter Matthews allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in years: the electric anticipation of the unknown. Thank you so much for staying with us this far. We know Peter's story is just beginning, and the best is definitely yet to come. Who do you think this mysterious woman is? What secrets is she hiding about Peter's past? And what will happen at their meeting tomorrow night? Madrid has already begun to weave its spell around our protagonist, but as Eduardo warned him on the plane, this city has a way of capturing souls. Will Peter find the fresh start he's looking for? Or has he walked directly into a trap more sophisticated than anything he faced in Chicago? Don't miss the next episode where Peter will venture into Madrid's local markets searching for answers, only to discover a mysterious box that will change everything. And what happens when the woman from the airport suddenly vanishes without a trace? The red veil she leaves behind will unlock secrets Peter never imagined possible. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of Peter's incredible journey. Leave us a comment telling us what you think will happen next. We love hearing your theories and predictions. The streets of Madrid are calling, and Peter Matthews is about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous journey is the one toward the truth about yourself.